Hey, how's it going everybody? Max DeVincenzo here from Foxtracks Music. Today I'm going to do some drum mixing for you, just walk you through my process as a studio drummer and composer myself, what I've noticed has worked really well for my kit and my setup, and some tips and tricks that I've learned along the way. So let's dive right in. First thing I'm going to do is just let you hear the mix that I have, and this is just drums. Another section here. Alright, so this piece is kind of a poppy song, kind of has some pop gospel influence to it. Wanted to keep the drums very, very simple and sparse. And then for the sound, let's go ahead and take off all the plugins that I have going so far. I'm going to mute the room. And let's just hear what it sounds like dry for a sec. So this is basically dry. The only difference here is just a little bit of level changes, a couple little panning changes that I'll talk about later. So first things first, whenever I record drums for the mix, my very first step is to go through each drum one at a time and just listen and see if there's anything I can do to that recording to make it sound more natural and more like the drum the way I want to hear it. So in some cases I'll use EQ just to emphasize some parts of the sound. Most cases I'll use EQ just to take out parts of the sound that are unpleasant. The whole time being very careful not to remove too much because you'll lose the thickness and warmth that is so characteristic of the drum sound today. So I'm going to go through one instrument at a time, one drum at a time, starting with the kick. So let's just listen to the kick on its own. This is an Audix D6 mic, just right inside the porthole. So on its own, it's fine. Here's what I did for EQ. It's a little bit extreme. Everything has a reason, I promise. So first thing that I wanted to do on this was just bring out some of the low end, just because it's a pop song and it's kick drum. There's not a whole lot going in any other instrument in the final version in this frequency, so bringing up some of the bass is fine there. So that's my EQ on it. It's without and with. So you notice I took out a lot of the mids here, and the only thing that's happening for me in the mid-range and the kick drum is this kind of like airy, whooshy sound. Almost sounds like a basketball a little bit. And I didn't like that at all, so I took that out. This is important. This is kind of like the frequency that makes a kick drum sound more ringy, a little bit less punctuated, a little bit less powerful. It's got that kind of mellow, ringy, hollow sound. It's terrible, terrible. So I usually go through and I just sweep until I can find this sound. Once you find it, you can just take your gain back down. And you'll notice it just tightens it up drastically. Much more airy. Okay, and then adding just a little bit of attack on the highs here. So moving on through, I also have a pretty intense compressor on here. And notice very slow attack, very quick release. You want a slow attack for drums because you don't want to get rid of the transient, the beginning of the drum hit. Right? That would be a slow attack. Sounds terrible. You lose all of the characteristics of the drum. But somewhere around there sounds great to me. Okay, so got a little compression, and then recently I've been using this transient master. Really been enjoying this. Just a tiny little bit more attack added, and then more importantly, I'm getting rid of a lot of sustain here. So without that on, it sounds a lot more open, a lot more sustain. And then with it. So the goal here was a kick drum that had power, had effect, but also is staying out of the way of all the other instruments, not getting in the way of the bass or even the snare. And what can happen with compression on kick drum, especially if you have a compressor that is a little bit too long, the attack is maybe not quite right, the release is not quite right for the tempo of the song, for the tuning of the kick drum, what happens is you get a kick drum sound that isn't lined up with the tempo or the pulse of the song. So even if your drummer is lined up, your kick drum sound could be crossing over into the next quarter note, the next eighth note, whatever the pulse is. We don't want that. It makes for a sloppy mix. Okay, let's talk about the snare for a minute. By the way, this snare is made by Dean Diamond in Longmont. It's a custom snare, and it's a piccolo, so it's very small. It's about this big. It's great. I love that thing. Okay, so EQ on this, completely different than the kick drum. I mean, obviously it should be. And I'm not touching the sound a whole lot. So here's without the EQ. And with. Very, very similar. The only difference that I can really hear is a little bit of thickness down here added, just to get a little bit more warmth from the snare. And I'm cutting what I believe is a little bit of kind of like room sound airiness here. Oops, sounds like this. Just nothing good there for me. It sounds kind of weak, so I want to pull that frequency out just a little bit. And then we have high end boosted just a touch. But I also have a little bit of a compressor going in this EQ. So it's bringing the highs up, but it's keeping them controlled at the same time. And then for me, the super high-end frequency is just kind of bright and brittle. So don't need a lot of that. There's some hi-hat in there, so I just like to duck that out just a little bit. But very, very, very mild EQ for the snare. Let's look at the compression. So on snare, I like to have a little bit more of an intense compression. Same thing, like pretty slow attack, pretty fast release. Let's see what this sounds like if I bring the threshold down so we can really hear what it's doing. So it's kind of, for me, it's accenting the attack of it and then getting out of the way so that some of that decay can ring through also. Again, you don't want a fast attack on snare, 129. I mean, if that's the effect you're going for, that's great. Right, so somewhere around there. Felt good for the attack. The idea is you want to hear the stick before the compression, and then right after the stick happens, the compressor kicks in. Okay, so that's it on the snare, just a little bit EQ, a little bit of compression. And this was being sent to a film composer, and he was going to be doing some mixing on it, so I didn't want to go nuts. You know, I want to leave stuff a little bit more open, a little bit more flexible, so he had some options down the road. Okay, overhead. So the overheads are space pair, should be about equidistant from the snare. I did do a little bit of fixing, they weren't exactly right, so I put a little bit of a stereo adjuster on there. but just some mild EQ on here, I believe. Let's see. Cutting some lows for sure. I didn't really want the kick involved in the overheads. You can see the snare drum right here. That's kind of the fundamental for the snare drum, so I wanted to bring that out just a little bit. Cutting some room. Again, just frequencies that don't sound great. Those just sound kind of weak, airy, washy. So what I do for overhead, or for any drum for that matter, is I go through and I kind of just scan like this, you know, do a sweep and see. You don't want to do an intense sweep because everything will sound bad if you're up this far. But you want to do just something mild and kind of listen for frequencies that just don't feel good. And for me, this range and this range was just not feeling good. There's also some up here, kind of radio sound, like not very fun. So again, you want to be careful, especially with cutting lows. You don't want to cut too much lows on all these drums. And so I would stay away from, you know, a full cut like that. That would be very drastic. You want some of that warmth and that thickness to remain, even if it's not necessary for each of those instruments. So this might even be a little bit intense. Just don't want too much kick in that overhead. Okay, this is the imaging that I adjusted here. So I was really determined to get the snare exactly centered on this. So this doesn't adjust too much. It just kind of changes the width of the stereo field, almost like the panning, but it does it in a way where it doesn't sound like you're just flopping it over to one side or the other. It does it in a very unique, transparent way. So this is with it on. You can see that the snare is basically centered here. If I take this off, you can see the snare is pretty far left. Yep, a bit more left. That just felt more even and more controlled to me, so I went with that. And then this also has a compressor on it, C2. This is just to rein in some of the transients. I'm not really trying to color the overheads. Just want to control them a little bit because they're very snappy, especially with the cymbals. Stuff was a little bit close to the mics on this, so I wanted to make sure that those transients weren't going to pop any of the other tracks. So just very, very mild controlling here. Again, a little bit faster attack actually because we're not doing such an intense compression, but fast release here. I actually brought the gain down too. So it just makes it a little bit more even. It's doing what traditionally a compressor is supposed to do. It's supposed to bring the lows and the highs a little bit closer together, compress them. And that's it on the overhead. Okay, moving on through toms. I fussed with this rack tom for longer than any other drum on here because check out this frequency here. So here's just rack. Let's find a section with toms. Hear that ringing? I wanted to get rid of that. Oh, it's just awful. So controlled that really nicely. Here, I'll show you the before and after. And then also some ringing here. And that's just the effect of the mic being on the tom, being that close. There's some frequencies that I just was not happy with. But I'll show you an A-B of this. Hear that? It's just something unwanted in the sound of the tom, so I took it out. Sounds much cleaner. And then looks like a little bit of mids here also. Not anything doing it for me there. It sounds just too much like attack. And for my tom mics, what I usually like to do is go for more of the warmth and the tone of the tom sound, and then leave the attack for the overhead mics. Okay, and then also on the toms is a gate, just to keep the recording clean. Yep, so you get just a quicker attack, quicker sustain, excuse me, on the toms. Floor tom, we're on the home stretch here. Just added some of the lows that are kind of like the fundamental frequency of the floor tom. That nice deep sound. And then same thing here, just taking out some of the frequencies that I felt were not adding to the sound. Like that's just kind of washiness here. Not doing a whole lot for me. So I took it out, took out some of the mids. Nothing too fancy. Same thing, a little gate here. And the hi-hat, I am very excited about the hi-hat mic I'm using. I'm actually using an SM7B, which is traditionally a vocal mic. I'm using it because it has such a close pattern, which means, you know, if you get far away from the mic, you lose your signal really quickly. And if you're close, it captures only what's very close to it. So for hi-hat, that's awesome. Not getting a whole lot of bleed. That's what this sounds like. Definitely some snare in there. Let's turn this up for a second. But it's mostly hi-hat, and that's a challenge. And you notice I had the hi-hat very, very low. I think we're at maybe like -7, -11, because so much of the information is already in the overheads here. A lot of hi-hat, right? It's pretty prominent. So all this is really doing, this hi-hat mic, is in case the final mixer wants to use it for any reason. And then just the same thing as the toms, overhead's taking care of most of the drums, but just adding some of the warmth, some of the thickness. So right here, I'm kind of accenting the stick thickness here. Let's solo the hi-hat. Just some mids in there. And it's funny, listening back, I'm like, that's snare. But so it sounded good. I think I remember what happened on this is, this was almost like, I just tried this, and for whatever reason it sounded nice, and maybe it's adding just a little bit of warmth, a little bit of softness to the hi-hat. So I left it. It's like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And then here we're definitely cutting like that fundamental snare frequency again, and then a lot of the kick and low sounds. We just don't need that for the hi-hat. And then same thing here, we have a little bit of compression here, just on the highs. Bring them up, but keep them controlled still. And then just cutting a frequency that I felt didn't need to be there. And again, hi-hat, you could almost do without it. This is with hi-hat. Here's without the mic. Very, very subtle. It's just adding a little bit of closeness to that sound. And real quick on pans, before we go to the drum bus, I'm going to bring up my mixing window here. You'll see that I have the hi-hat matched to where it's happening in the overhead mics. Same thing with the floor tom, same thing with the rack tom. Snare and kick are centered. So I'm trying to match the overhead imaging with these close mics. Okay, and then all these drums are being routed into this drums bus here. And all I have on the drums bus is a compressor. Very mild compressor. Just kind of summing those nicely. Little gain added there. Again, it's just kind of thickening it up a little bit. It's also containing it, controlling it a little bit, so we're not getting any really intense peaks or anything like that. That's it for the drums, except for my room sound. And this is something that I started doing a couple years ago, is just keeping the room itself dead where I record, and then being able to choose what kind of reverb sound I want for each individual recording. So, you know, ideally, you could be in a studio with 7 different rooms, you know, a small room to a big room. But the reverbs are just amazing nowadays, and I like being able to control it. So that's the route that I've been going. This is my room sound. And that just makes all the difference in the world. Drum sound, a lot of it is just the room. So huge difference here, no room. With room. It just gives it some room to breathe, which is really nice. And then what did I have? Oh, cool little trick here. So I want most of the drums to have reverb on them, but I don't want the kick drum to have reverb on it. And so what I did here, just because the kick exists a little bit in the overhead, exists a little bit in the snare mic, kind of everywhere. Drums bleed, it's just kind of how they are. They're very close to each other. I put a compressor on the room and I sidechained the kick to it. So what happens is every time the kick plays, it ducks the room sound just for a second, exactly how you can see in this, this graphic right here. Right, every time the kick plays, the room gets compressed just a little bit. So all it does is it thickens up the kick and makes it sound a little bit like larger than life, because it's actually because of this effect that our ears and our brain have, which when we hear a really loud sound, our ears kind of have like a built-in compressor in a way where we hear a really loud sound and our hearing drops really quickly. So that's why when you have sidechain compression like this, it makes that sound so much bigger than life, more intense, more powerful. It's because it reminds us of that phenomenon subconsciously, which I think is very interesting. Anyway, nice big kick, and it just gives it an extra little punch that I was looking for. That's it. That's it for drums. So I know that was a long process, but I've been doing this for a long time, and I can tell you that it goes by very quickly when you're just thinking about it, feeling what needs to be done to each of the drums, and just going about it quickly and intuitively. So I hope that was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions, and we'll see you next time.